Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Tobin, and I'm a partner specialising in insurance and reinsurance at Mills and Reeve. And I'm hoping to be joined for today's presentation by Peter Wedge of Swiss Re. However, at the time of starting this presentation, he was having some technical difficulties in joining, but hopefully he'll join us in a minute or two. Peter is Reinsurance Wordings Counsel at Swiss Re's headquarters in Zurich, and will be sharing his insights about trends and developments in this area in the second half of this session. In terms of housekeeping, today's session is one way. You can see us, but we can't see you. The session is being recorded, and copies of the link to this session with slides will be sent out afterwards. We will finish at 11:30 sharp. If you have questions, please type them into the question and answer box, where my colleague Harriet Strevens will collate them for us to deal with at the end. Today's session is the second in a series looking at political violence and insurance. The first one looked at the history of political violence and insurance and is available on our website. In terms of the agenda, political violence is a huge topic, but in my 10 minutes, I've decided just to touch on three particular points to look out for if you're handling claims in this area. Firstly, the meaning of political violence perils. We'll have a word on causation and a look at how the normal rules of causation are often changed by the policy wording in this area. And then we'll touch briefly on the burden of proof, the normal rules of which are also often changed by the policy wording. And then Peter will talk to trends and developments from his perspective. I'm going to approach these topics primarily through the lens of exclusionary language, because that's what most of the reported cases are concerned with. Property policies exclude all of the political violence perils, and political violence policies cover specific perils, but they also exclude all of the other perils that have not been specifically purchased. So it's all about the exclusions, whichever side of the fence you're on. On the slide is the NMA 2918, which is the London Market's standard exclusion in property wordings. And in our first session, I traced its history and evolution. I won't read out all of it, but I just want to highlight three aspects of it, and this is an edited version. Firstly, in the middle part of the wording is a long list of excluded perils: war, invasion, foreign enemies, hostilities, warlike operations, civil war, rebellion, revolution, insurrection, civil commotion assuming the proportions of or amounting to an uprising, military or usurped power. And then there's number two, any act of terrorism. And the point I want to note is that all of these terms, with the exception of terrorism, are undefined in the wording. Actually, the wording contains quite a long definition of terrorism, which I've missed out of the slide in the interest of brevity. But we'll come back to the perils in a moment. Secondly, note that the first paragraph of the wording says that the policy excludes losses not only directly, but indirectly caused by a list of perils. In fact, it says directly or indirectly caused by, resulting from, or in connection with any of the following, regardless of any other cause or event, and so on. That language makes the exclusion very wide, as we shall see. And the final part of the wording says, if the underwriters allege that by reason of this exclusion, any loss, damage, cost or expense is not covered by this insurance, then the burden of proving the contrary shall be upon the insured. And that language is very helpful to insurers in practice, as we shall see. So turning first to the perils, by which I mean what exactly are the phenomena that insurers are trying either to exclude from standard policies or to specifically insure in the political violence market. Now, down the left-hand side of the slide, I've listed the perils that appear in standard market exclusions. And the key point I want to make is that those terms are never defined on the face of the wording. And also in many cases, the meaning of them is not at all obvious to the lay reader. The only exception to that is act of terrorism, which has no common law meaning and is usually defined longhand in exclusions, in standard exclusions, and has been since 9/11 at the latest. But in fact, the exclusion goes back a bit longer than that. So why are most of these terms undefined in standard exclusions? Well, it's because the drafters of this clause were happy to leave the meaning of these perils open to judicial interpretation. And that wasn't too concerning for them because they would have been well aware that most of the perils had already been considered by the English courts in cases going back over 100 years. And under our system of legal precedent, a court considering the meaning of these words now is usually bound to give those words the same interpretation as was given in those previous cases. So the practical point is, if you're handling one of these claims, then it's not sufficient just to look in dictionaries to try and find the legal meaning of these perils. Rather, it's usually necessary to refer to the case law. Now, in passing, I note that the position with policies that ensure political violence is slightly different. In those policies, all of the perils are usually expressly defined, and the insured can select which ones it wants to buy. And those perils and definitions are similar to, but not exactly the same as those at common law. But the common law context is relevant to all of these policies. Can we have the next slide, please? So this slide shows the Spinneys department store in Beirut in the 1970s. Unfortunately for Spinneys, during civil unrest in 1976, 2 Spinneys stores were seriously looted and damaged. Spinneys had policies that expressly covered riot losses generally, but that cover was also subject to broad exclusions, very similar to those in the NMA 2918. The claim was declined and Spinneys sued Royal Insurance in the High Court in London. Now, in a nutshell, the outcome of the Spinneys case was that the rioting and looting losses at the shop were nevertheless excluded from that riot coverage because they were all caused, at least indirectly, by one or more of the excluded perils. In particular, the rather obscure perils of usurped power and a civil commotion assuming the proportions of a popular rising. Now, I'm afraid that we don't really have time to dissect Spinneys in detail today, but I'm mentioning it because it's the most famous reported case on the topic of political violence insurance. And it's also the most useful one because in it, one of our most respected judges drew the strands together from more than 100 years of cases and set out what he thought the legal meanings were of most of the perils. Can we have the next slide, please? So, for example, one of the questions for the court to decide was whether the unrest in Lebanon constituted a civil war. And so the court had first to define what a civil war was. And in doing so, the judge looked back at all of the cases. And drawing the strands together, somewhat obviously you might think, the court concluded that a civil war is a type of war with the characteristic of being internal. But it must still be a war nevertheless, rather than some other kind of violent internal struggle. According to the judge, war must have clear and identifiable sides to which individuals owe allegiance, and it must be possible to identify each side by reference to features such as objectives, leadership, or administration. There can be more than 2 sides, but the judge said that if the factions are too numerous, then the struggle is no more than a melee without delineation of sides and is therefore not a war. He referred to, in the context of a civil war, he noted that participants' motives could be tribal, ethnic, or racial, or even simply to change the way the power the way power is exercised without necessarily the intention to change the nature of government itself. And he also emphasized that a war is something that happens on a certain scale. And he went on to set out a non-exhaustive list of factors that might be relevant in judging that, such as the effect on public order and inhabitants, the number of combatants, casualties, scale of armament, whether territory was occupied, the duration, whether territory was controlled, and so on and so forth. Now, on the facts of Spinneys, he found that although Lebanon was in a state of serious unrest, it had not at that point, at the time of losses, amounted to a civil war. But the point is that his definition and approach to the concept of civil war, and indeed war, is legally important and stands to this day. So if you come across those concepts, then you need to go back to Spinneys and some other cases. As to the policy in Spinneys also excluded losses indirectly caused by insurrection or rebellion, and the court set out what those terms mean. As to rebellion, the judge started with the Oxford English Dictionary definition of organised resistance to the ruler or government of one's country, to which he then added his own gloss that there must also be the purpose of supplanting the ruler or depriving it of territory. He found that insurrection had a similar meaning to rebellion, but perhaps denotes a rebellion in its early stages or a rebellion with a lesser degree of organisation. Now, I considered insurrection in detail earlier this year after the unrest at the US Capitol in my article entitled Insurrection in Insurance Law, which you can find on our website. Next slide, please. Just to touch on one more peril, the judge in Spinneys agreed with insurers in this case that the riot losses were indirectly caused by the excluded peril of usurped power. But to reach that conclusion, he had first to work out what that term meant. And this is a good example of a completely arcane legal word that has no everyday meaning. However, it's extremely old and in fact comes from criminal cases under the Treason Act of 1351 and appears in insurance wordings in reported cases going back as far as the 18th century. Now, those cases drew distinctions between common mobs or rioters or treasonous rioters who de facto had usurped the king's authority, intentionally or otherwise. And in the Spinneys case, the judge's view that what usurped power is getting at is the arrogation to itself by the mob of lawmaking and law enforcing power which properly belongs to the sovereign. Although he said it didn't need to amount to a rebellion, but it must be possible still to identify a warlike posture or universality of purpose amongst the participants. So it's essentially getting at a state of serious lawlessness, something more than a riot, but perhaps less than an insurrection, rebellion, or civil war. Now, in the example of Lebanon, there was no civil war, but trained militias and armed civilians were taking control of neighborhoods themselves and thereby usurping the functions of the state, meaning that the exclusion applied. And there are plenty of other perils defined in the cases, particularly Spinneys, but I'm afraid we don't have time to examine them all today. But the main point I'm trying to make is that most of these words have very particular meaning and nuances, and it's essential to look at the case law to know what they mean. Next slide, please. But establishing what peril might have been occurring at the relevant time is only the first step. The next step is to ask if that peril is sufficiently connected with the relevant loss so as to be excluded or covered, as the case may be. Now, most property policies and some political violence policies exclude losses that are directly or indirectly caused by an excluded peril. And that's relatively unusual in insurance policies. Typically in insurance, we are concerned with direct or proximate causes of loss. That is to say, we tend to try to work out if the if the main cause of loss was an excluded or covered peril, and more remote or indirect causes of loss are disregarded. But that's not the case when you see this indirect language, the purpose of which is to allow the insurer to reach back further and wider into the chain of causation to identify an excluded peril. So, for example, in Spinneys, the policy expressly covered riot, but excluded losses indirectly caused by a long list of perils, the relevant ones of which turned out to be usurped power and civil commotion, assuming the proportions of a popular rising. Now, the point here was that the proximate cause of the loss was rioting or looting, and there was no direct evidence of a link between the rioting and looting and the militias or the wider political situation. But the court was prepared to look at the big picture and to infer an indirect connection, which meant that the losses were not covered. So how far can one go back into the chain of causation to find an excluded peril where you see this indirect language? Well, quite a long way. The judge said that, quote, plainly there must be some limit on the application of the clause, for the chain of causation recedes infinitely into the past. The draftsman must have intended to stop somewhere, and that place must be the point at which an event ceases to be the cause of loss and merely becomes an item of history. Next slide, please. This picture shows gunmen outside Fiji's parliament in 2000. Sorry, this is an illustration of the principle I just set out. They'd seized parliament and arrested the prime minister in a coup d'etat. Down the road in Suva, the same day, Mr. Tapu's shop was looted and burned by persons unknown, seemingly for private gain, and he claimed under his all risks policy. The court found that the coup d'etat amounted to an insurrection, which was an excluded peril, but there was no evidence at all of a direct link between those participating in the coup and the looters and arsonists of Mr. Tapu's shop. In other words, it couldn't be said that the coup was the proximate cause of loss. But the court went on to find that the coup was the cause or catalyst of the breakdown in law and order, and that therefore there was at least an indirect link with the looting, and so the loss was excluded as being indirectly due to insurrection. So I suppose the general point here is look at the causation language carefully and take it into account. If the wording mentions indirect causation, then you need also to consider any potentially indirect but excluded perils. And I find that this is a point that is often overlooked when claims are handled in the market. Finally, I wanted to highlight the reverse burden of proof wording at the end of these exclusions, in standard property exclusions, and sometimes you see it in exclusions in political violence policies too, which says that if the underwriters allege that by reason of this exclusion, any loss, damage, cost, or expense is not covered by this insurance, the burden of proving the contrary shall be upon the assured. Now, this has been tested in the English courts, who have held it to mean that insurers must provide some evidence that a loss was only arguably excluded by an excluded peril. And after that, the burden shifts to the insured to prove with evidence that the loss was in fact caused by a covered peril. And in practice, that can be hard to do. And as far as I'm aware, insureds have not succeeded in getting around that clause in any of the reported cases. It's a really powerful device in the hands of insurers, makes it much easier for them to rely on exclusions in dynamic situations where it's hard to gather clear evidence as to exactly what caused losses. Now, I think that's enough from me and the law books, and I'm hoping that Peter has now been able to join the call and is free to. Peter, you are here.
Yes, I'm here, indeed, yeah.
Welcome. I'd like to hand over Peter, please, to make some observations about trends and developments from his point of view at Swiss Re.
Yep, I will do. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was very interesting. I would like to say First of all, this indirect causation actually was a hot debate in these communicable disease exclusions. And that was really what everyone was talking about and saying that the exclusions are going too far. So I think the indirect part is always difficult for people to get their head around. And where you mentioned about terms not defined in a contract, but in case law, I see that a lot in continental Europe. People don't understand this concept of case law. If it's not defined in a contract, they find it very difficult to understand exactly what it means. But moving on to trends, I would say essentially, property owners and businesses probably accept sort of multinationals. They tend to overlook this political violence insurance, and they're probably basically underinsured because of that. And the fact is that a lot of seemingly stable countries appear to be no longer immune from the perils of civil and political unrest. So I think we will see some premium growth in the area going forward. If you look at the digital age, I think you've got two sides of it. So you've got, on the one hand, insurers and reinsurers have more data to predict hotspots and improve the pricing and the risk selection. But on the other hand, you see that it's brought actually different types of political violence compared to earlier times. So social media, for example, means that the unrest can be more coordinated and, for example, more widespread geographically, like the Arab Spring, and potentially they can last longer. So you've got the yellow vests having their protest and meeting every weekend. So it's not so much spontaneous. If you go back 100 years, basically things would just happen in a kind of a small area and very spontaneously. Now things have changed quite rapidly. But on the other hand, the increase in data has to be correctly analyzed. So if you've got inequality in society, will that really lead to looting, like in the case of South Africa, when political violence erupts? It's difficult to judge. So the digital trends kind of help you to an extent, but also work against you as an insurer and a reinsurer. Going back to the reverse burden of proof, I think essentially this is nothing new, right? But it has come to the fore again in the communicable disease exclusions and some cyber exclusions. So not all cyber exclusions, but you've seen basically Lloyd's Market Association throw this in sometimes. And I would say it makes sense probably for the reverse burden of proof to apply, where it's difficult for reinsurers to prove that something that in practice is very difficult to prove. So, where something is extremely difficult to prove, that basically as you're the reinsurer, you're essentially putting the full limit at risk, something so fundamental to the cover, then I think it's fair for the reinsurer or for the insurer to have this difficult burden for the insured or for the reinsured. But to be honest, I mean, on the other hand, you've got the cedants are pushing back at this and saying, look, we think this is not really fair to us. It's actually it's a hurdle for us on the other hand. So we don't want it used in all the cases, only really when it's fundamental to the cover. Turning now to the reinsurance side, I would say essentially that, like cyber, which is essentially man-made, and natural catastrophes, the hot topic tends to be in the political violence area is aggregation. So insurers on the one hand want adequate aggregation, and reinsurers need to closely monitor sort of regional aggregation so they don't have too much at stake in one particular country across the various portfolios of the cedants. And as usual, the fine print of the loss occurrence clause will determine if and how and to what extent an event can be aggregated. And this is when you would turn to someone like Andrew Tobin to help you. So basically, normally for political violence, the unifying factor, so to speak, would be the same purpose or the same cause. And at Swiss Re, we're frequently asked to come up with a standard event definition for political violence. So basically, what losses can you add together in terms of political violence? I would say generally, terrorism has the tightest aggregation parameters in terms of time and place, followed by other perils like sabotage, strikes, riots, civil commotions, malicious damage. And then things like war on land, coup d'etat, revolution, military usurped power, insurrection, mutiny, rebellion, civil war. They would have basically a longer time which they could aggregate the losses, but we would like to keep it just to one geographic country. That's what you saw, in various insurrections in the past, that they tend to go over the borders. And then basically, according to the reinsurance contract, that part of it wouldn't be covered because that just takes it too far, which means basically the loss will be too big to insure or to reinsure. And I think like any peril, the reinsurance underwriter, of course, needs a deep knowledge of the original policy language. We've seen that, especially with the COVID situation and these communicable disease exclusions didn't really exist. But you saw lots of extensions to the original covers, basically non-damage extensions, which the underwriter didn't really understand or didn't realize that these policies were issued at such a rapid rate. So going back to political violence, the other hot topics are still going to be, the appropriate cyber exclusions. I think generally speaking, you would hope to replace the CL380 and pick up something like the LMA 5409, but that depends on each party's appetite. Also, NCBR is a hot topic, and going back again, the communicable disease exclusions, essentially the insurers brought them in last year, so you'll probably have them in all your treaties. But more or less, the standard one will be the LMA 5394. I think in general terms, the reinsurance contracts, very simply, they contain a lot of words which require interpretation. You've got limited case law, you've got non-standard language, and you've got vague reinsurance contracts. And you would think there would be lots of disputes, but in fact, at the reinsurance level, there's only a handful of disputes, I would say. Now you have more, of course, because you've got the COVID situation, and people were very unsure, and you had huge amounts of money at stake. So I think now you've probably got more disputes at the reinsurance level than you have for a long time. But in general terms, you wouldn't have so many. So few disputes would go to court or arbitration. And this is generally down to commercial relationships. Basically, you've got repeat customers. You've only got a limited number of insurers in the world, and you need to get along with them. For companies like, say, Zurich, AIG, Chubb, etc., you would have, for example, more than 100 different reinsurance contracts. And also the brokers would be very important to you at all. So therefore, you're not going to go to war, so to speak, on every kind of contract. You come to a commercial resolution. I mean, the best, of course, is when both insurers and reinsurers understand the underwriting intent of the reinsurance cover, but that doesn't always happen. Just to mention that when losses are clearly covered, let's take the South African disturbances as an example. That was clearly covered, I think, and you can see that the reinsurers paid very, very quickly. And that's really the function of reinsurance. But when the contracts are clear, everyone understands what's going on, what's supposed to be covered, and you have an event which falls within that language, and then the reinsurers are able quickly to pay the money to enable the insurers then to pay their losses. So I'd like to hand the baton back to Harriet, and maybe we have some questions in between.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for this fascinating session. Unfortunately, we are about to run out of our 30 minutes time maximum. My only one question, I suppose, Andrew, to you, if I may, is about the evidential aspect of what it is you need to be able to prove that the incident is one of the perils insured.
Well, thank you, Harriet. I wonder if we could exceptionally perhaps extend the session by 10 minutes because we've had a very interesting extra contribution today, and I'm sure there might be one or two questions if we're allowed to. But thank you. So in terms of evidence and perils, yeah, evidence is key. So obviously you need evidence about the proximate cause of the loss. If the proximate cause was clearly a political violence peril, such as a terrorist bomb, well then it's pretty straightforward. If you're considering an exclusion, for example, and the proximate cause is an excluded peril, when the loss is excluded. But the point that I'm really trying to make is that very often in these situations, the proximate cause is often something that's covered, like fire or riot. And that's where the confusion starts, because people start trying to balance a covered peril on the one hand against excluded perils. But the correct approach really is to say, okay, well, the proximate peril might be covered, but what's the indirect cause? Because if there's an excluded indirect cause, then the loss is excluded. And to look at the indirect causes, one needs to gather as much evidence as possible and build it into a chronology. So evidence from news sources, journalists, experts, and so on, to build up a picture about the local political situation and history can be very, very important.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, very briefly, Peter, if I may, in terms of the reverse burden of proof that you were talking about, if trying to establish the true cause of a particular disturbance is difficult for reinsurers, it's presumably as difficult for the insured. So what is the remedy if it's not to be the application of the reverse burden of proof? I mean, do you have a view about this, such that you may not have already said?
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. Yeah, I mean, I did answer that to a certain extent. I think it's a great question, but essentially there's no easy answer. So you've got to balance the interests of the insurers and also the interests of the reinsurers. I would say perhaps that where the exclusion is so important, that is fundamental to the actual insurance or reinsurance cover, and the whole insurance reinsurance limit could be at risk. I think it seems fair to me that the party risking their capital, they should have the easier task. And perhaps where exclusions are less fundamental, I mean, we could take, for example, communicable disease. I mean, of course, you could lose a limit on that, but perhaps you wouldn't necessarily. Then probably the reverse burden of proof does not need to be applied. So it's essentially, I mean, of course, you've got the brokers on this. When you get to reinsurance, the brokers are very dominant. So I mean, you get the broker view as well. So I mean, I'm sure they would argue for that to say no reverse burden of proof in communicable disease exclusions, please, because they already go a long way because they have this word indirect, which no one really understands very well, apart from lawyers, essentially.
So what is it that stops the insurers and reinsurers from understanding the intent of reinsurance, which you've described as the best relationship?
I mean, I would say what stops them is that the underwriting intent is generally not written down or discussed in detail. And then the claim scenarios turn out to be slightly different to those expected, meaning that the words in the contracts, the insurance contract, don't exactly fit. So everyone has the intent in their head, including, of course, the insurance broker, which means the contractual parties are happy at the outset. Everyone thinks they know what's going to be covered, and then things don't turn out like that, and the words don't exactly match. And then that's really the problem. Of course, the underwriters, of course, it all comes down to evidence, as Andrew says. You need to write down your underwriting intent at the time the contract is written. But who really does that? I mean, people don't tend to do such things. So that's when it comes to the fact, later on in court, you have to say, what was your intent? You have to go through your underwriting guidelines, and hopefully you can find something that is written down at that time. But if you don't have that, you just have to go by what would you normally do with a risk of that nature, with all the facts you knew at that particular time.
Yes, tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tricky.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. We're now up to just over our time, so I'll pass the baton back to Andrew from this fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Peter, for that fascinating contribution. Please do connect with Peter or I on LinkedIn or through some other means. I'm sure you can find us on the web. And if you want to have a more detailed discussion about any of these topics, please do get in touch. Our next cover talk will be on the 18th of November, and it will be presented by James Thompson, who will be looking at D&O insurance. Thank you very much. Have a great day.